Good morning. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for our Northern Light Health Good Health is Good Business Zoom conference. We will start off today with an update on COVID-19 by Dr. Jarvis, a senior physician executive at Northern Light Health. We'll then have a presentation by Dr. Catherine McLaren, Vice President of Talent and Diversity at Northern Light Health. And Catherine will help us to understand generational differences in the workplace. I'm Dr. Ed Gilkey, Senior Physician Executive at Northern Light Beacon Health. I'll be your moderator for the next hour. Before we get started, I will read our legal disclosure. The coronavirus pandemic is an ongoing, continuously evolving situation. Northern Light Health encourages everyone to follow federal and state governmental guidance and mandates. The information presented in this session is provided for educational purposes only and is not meant to substitute professional or medical judgment. Northern Light Health does not know the particulars of your situation, so the information presented today is intended to be general in nature and may not apply to every individual situation. Northern Light Health and the presenters make no guarantees and warranties regarding any information provided. A reminder, this hour is for you. If at any time you have a question for our panelists, please use the Q&A function. I'll keep track of your questions and have our speakers respond. Also, I hope each of you will take a few minutes immediately following this hour to answer our quick 5-question survey. Your input directly affects our topics and helps guide our future conferences. Dr. Jarvis will start us off with the latest on COVID-19. Dr. Jarvis?
Well, thank you, Ed. First slide, please. So for a change, we're going to talk about some good news in terms of COVID-19. Currently across the state of Maine, we have the lowest number of hospitalizations over the past year, and that's welcome news for all of us. We're also continuing to see a decrease in community spread. For many of you who have been on these calls before, these two maps should be familiar to you. The one on the left is the COVID-19 community risk level map, which again is the risk of what a community has in terms of its handling the burden of COVID-19. So that takes into account hospitalizations, open hospital beds, transmission, and all the like. And you can see that the entire state of Maine, for the first time in a very long time, the community risk level is low. But if we look at the map on the right, that's the actual transmission rate, which we think is actually a little bit underreported. Why? Because most of us, when we do our COVID testing now, are not going to a facility. We're doing home testing, and so may or may not be reporting out the positive tests. And so this is a best guess of what we're talking about. But you can see that we still have some counties that have substantial spread and some that are moderate. But again, in a very long time, this is the first time that all of Maine does not have any in the high. And when we start talking about risk stratification and modifying the precautions that we've been using both within healthcare and without healthcare, having the entire state in green from a risk level is good news and allows us to downgrade some of those protective measures. And then having no county that's in this high area of community transmission further emphasizes that. So next slide, please. So we may start seeing that we'll see some lessening of some guidance around this continued protection. Somewhat of this is related to the end of the public health emergency declaration that happens in May. When that happens, some of the requirements and regulations that occurred due to the public health emergency go away and therefore allow us to have a little bit difference in there. But a lot of it is really based on things that we know now. So we know more about the transmission of this particular virus. We know that the vaccines help provide a significant amount of protection, and a lot of that helps us to change some of the guidance that we've been seeing. Some other good news is some recent data that has been discussed about preventing long COVID. And we've talked about long COVID at this forum before. I wish I could define long COVID for you, but there is no definition for it. And that's because COVID-19 causes a whole host of both acute problems and long-term chronic problems. And we lump all of those long-term chronic problems under the auspice of long COVID. But two studies just came out recently that said that if you have had at least 2 of the COVID vaccines, that your likelihood of getting long COVID is less, and significantly less at that. And if you start treatment with Paxlovid within 5 days of symptoms, also helps to prevent long COVID. So those are important factors. And so when you start talking to your workers, your customers, your friends, your family about why it is so important for them to get vaccinated, and why, if they do contract COVID, if they're in a high-risk situation, that they should start Paxlovid, this is yet another reason for that, because long COVID affects a lot of individuals and is keeping a lot of people out of the productive workforce. And then statewide, we're doing some research and collaborations that are looking at ways that we can prevent and treat long COVID. So those are all wonderful, good news. Next slide, please. But we do need to remain vigilant. Like I said, COVID is still spreading in our communities. There is no community that has low activity of community spread here in the state of Maine. And so that means that there is still COVID out there, particularly for those people who are at high risk of severe disease. They do need to remain vigilant. And I do continue to say that for my patients, that I recommend that they mask if they're going to be in an indoor setting with a large number of people and they're going to be there for a prolonged period of time. There's other things that we have to worry about too, is that there are new variants and subvariants which may pose some risks for us. There's one particular one that we are looking at. It's XBB 1.16. We were talking about XBB 1.15 before as being the predominant strain here in the United States, and it still remains the predominant strain here in the United States. But that 1.6 number is starting to take hold in a few other countries. Right now, it's a little bit too early for us to know whether or not it is more contagious or more infectious than the current strain that's dominant here in the United States and here in Maine, or whether it's causing more severe disease. And again, we start to look at differences now with these variants in local areas. So we've seen some before that have caused significant disease in other parts of the world, but not so much in the United States. And 1.16 may be one that is like that. And then, of course, we always have to worry about disease X. And disease X is simply an unknown either variant of COVID-19 or a completely new disease that just crops up. So thankfully, some of the lessons that we learned with COVID-19 keep us in reminding us that we have to worry about the unknown and that we have to be prepared for if and when that unknown event occurs. And with that, I think, Ed, I think you might have had some questions about variants for me.
I do. Actually, it's a pretty interesting topic. So tell us a little bit about, we're seeing these recombinant subvariants, and it's like XBB that you just described, but it's a combination of two subvariants. And how does that differ from the single variant that develops a subvariant lineage that, we've gotten used to? What's kind of different going on here?
Yeah, so first is some very basic molecular biology. So remember, these are RNA viruses, and RNA viruses different than DNA. DNA viruses and DNA animals, like human beings, are incredibly complex. And therefore, when mutations occur within those, they often fail because of the complexities that have to happen for a DNA organism to exist. But RNA organisms, they're not that complex and therefore do not need a whole lot of structure about them to continue to exist even when they have mutations. And so mutations can occur in two different ways, really. One is just a spontaneous mutation. So there's an error in the coding of the RNA and that changes the virus. Sometimes that leads to a virus that's more successful than a virus that didn't have that mutation. And sometimes it leads to the virus, petering out. There's another way that it happens, particularly with RNA viruses, is that if somebody gets infected with two different variants or subvariants of a particular virus, they can kind of join up and mix and match their RNA material, which then can create a new variant of that virus. And that's kind of what we saw in the XBB family, is that they're really a combination of two of a prior family together. Again, sometimes that will result in a weaker strain, meaning that it peters out and we don't see it. We probably never even heard about that happening. But occasionally what it does is it creates a stronger virus. And that's what happened with the XBB families. It made it a more stable virus that was able to evade some of the things that we were using to treat COVID-19. Thankfully, they're still all under the umbrella of the Omicron family, which has been one that we've been dealing with really for 2 years now. And that's good news for us because the bivalent vaccine that most people should have gotten by now, and if you haven't, I encourage you to get it, and I encourage you to tell other people to get it, actually continues to fight against that, specifically against the Omicron family. And thankfully, these new variants, particularly with their mix and match of RNA, that particular bivalent one continues to give us protection.
Yeah, thanks for all that information. It really gives some insight. And I think I may have said this half dozen times over the last couple of years, but this is evolution before our very eyes. I mean, it really is quite fascinating. While it's at some level a little bit scary to understand that viruses are capable of these things, but it's very, very interesting from a biologic point of view. I have
Yeah,
another
and you're right.
question for you.
It really is
Yeah,
about evolution. It's just that viruses, when we get
they're
infected, we
quicker.
have millions of copies of them, and then it allows evolution to occur a lot faster.
Hmm. Yeah, it makes you appreciate, like on a larger scale, how evolution can work. I have another question for you, and
Sure.
this one's about some of the nomenclature that we're hearing, like how they name the viruses. So we had been hearing about BA5, BA4, BQ, BF, now XBB, and then XBB1, 1.5. But we're also hearing names like Delta, Omicron, and then there's a new one out there that we're hearing about, Arcturus in India. And in India, they're saying this is one to watch. So what do you make of the significance? So two questions, I guess, are built into there. A comment about that nomenclature, and then another about Arcturus specifically.
Yeah, so nomenclature is continuing to be a problem for us. And that's because if we remember, we started to just use Greek letters. So it was the original strain, then the alpha strain, then the beta strain, then the delta, and then Omicron. There was actually a few others in there that petered out that we never had to worry about. And that's because at the time we thought the virus was going to change slowly. But what happened with Omicron is we found that the virus was changing quite frequently, and we couldn't keep up, and we were going to run out of Greek letters. And besides, Greek letters were never really a common thing. So that's when scientists started to use a new nomenclature, and that's when you started hearing about the B variants, then the BA variants, then the XBB variants. Thankfully, all of those fell under the Omicron family, so a large grouping, but all those subsets within that large family. So that's what science uses. Unfortunately, we have people out there that have decided to come up with their own nomenclature, and that's where that particular virus that you just mentioned is. It actually is the XBB 1.16 variant that I spoke about just a few minutes ago. It's just that for the media, they have kind of latched on to a new name, and that's where Arcturus came from. I don't know if it has any particular meaning or relevance. I couldn't find that the word meant anything. You are correct that in India, they are seeing that this might be causing some more significant disease, particularly in a pediatric population, which is why it warrants us continue to watch it. Thankfully, it's only been found in a handful of states here in the United States and has not yet become a dominant strain. But if that happens and we do start seeing pediatric cases here that are more severe than we've seen before, that will be a cause for concern for us, particularly here in Maine, where we have very limited inpatient bed availability for pediatric patients.
Mm. Yeah, so thanks for that explanation, Jim. So you and I and lots of others that we work with will keep an eye on this for our audience over the coming weeks. So thanks, Jim.
Always a pleasure, Ed. Thank you.
Next is Catherine McLaren, who will speak with us about generational differences in the workplace. A reminder to type your questions in the Q&A function. Catherine?
Good morning. Thank you, Dr. Gilkey. I'm delighted to be here this morning with all of you. And I find this a really interesting topic, and we could probably spend days on it. And in fact, there are lots of trainings that do. So we're going to sort of go over an overview and dive a little deeper into some components of it. And of course, I welcome questions. What I wanted to start with was just a definition of what is a generation, because I think that's helpful. And essentially, they're cohorts of people with shared experiences, usually a common birth period, significant events that happen during formative years, and social changes, which could be a significant event that happen during formative years, that end up creating some amount of sort of collective peer personalities and mindsets. Next slide, please. And what I wanted, sorry, it's not the next slide, it's the, oh, I apologize. Can you go back to the last one? Thank you. Sorry, I should have just said right click or whatever. What I really want to focus on here is assumptions, because I think where we get ourselves, I think that the whole notion of sort of generational differences and themes can be useful and has a utility. My experience is that where we sometimes get ourselves in trouble is making assumptions about people, essentially based on their age and their the generation that they're in, and it can be a way that we sort of get stuck in even trying to have more of a conversation around it. If someone is X, then, and depending on what our perception is of what X is, then we may just get stuck there and not explore further, which can get in the way, as we all know, around really understanding and being able to work well together. I want to say one other thing before we go to the next slide, which is that there is some other research that indicates that, of course, in addition to, when we were born and our formative experiences, and by the way, I should also say, even though it's obvious that, you and I can have grown up at the same time, but had extraordinarily different experiences. And so when you really start to dig into it, again, our perceptions about generational differences are sort of broad strokes and very general. And when you start to dig down, not true for a lot of people, or sort of very variantly true for people. One of the things that the research is showing is that in addition to someone's age, the other really impactful factor is sort of where they are in their life. And this is specifically in terms of the workplace, but of course, I'm sure it's true across the board. So for example, some people are delaying what was traditionally a time to have children until much later. And sometimes you can have people working with you who are at the same place in terms of where they are with child rearing, but very different ages. And that can have a big factor in, be a big factor in influencing what they want from work, what they're looking for from work, what their major concerns are, et cetera. So that's just one of a lot of examples of other factors that can influence what someone is looking for at work. Next slide, please. Okay, thank you. So we're going to take a quick poll here because I just want to get a sense of what who our audience is. So if you would, please check the one of the 4 that is most accurate for you in terms of your generation. Okay, great. So it looks like we don't have any Gen Zs represented, which isn't shocking because at the moment they're making up the smallest part of our workforce. Gen X, which happens to be the group that I identify with as well. Millennials and baby boomers. Great. So we have a good mix. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is probably familiar to you in the sense that you may have seen something like this in the past. We won't spend a ton of time on it, but I do want to say a couple of things. First, that the birth years for each of these groups may vary a little bit depending on what source you look at. So there's just that sort of caveat. And the current age also, for that reason, could look a little different. The percent of US workforce, I'm just going to draw your attention to, you can see that right now, Gen X and the millennials make up the biggest population of our workforce, with baby boomers right behind that, and then Gen X is coming up and coming up fast. And we do still have some traditionalists. We're not going to talk so much about traditionalists in this conversation, but we have had 5 generations in the workforce before, which makes it really interesting. And a couple of things I would just draw your attention to is that, as we know, baby boomers and Gen Xers had a time before technology. As a Gen Xer, many of my formative years, we didn't have nearly the technological access that and tools that we have today. And for Gen Z, most people who identify with that generation have no coherent memory of 9/11, although they haven't really known a stable sort of nonviolent life, either between domestic and foreign things going on. Arguably, you could say that about just about any generation, but it is something that comes up in the research around their formative years. The millennials are the largest generation. I know for a long time that it was, that the baby boomers were the biggest generation, and but the millennials are actually, I think, 92 million, and baby boomers 77. So this is a huge group of people who are going to make up the bulk of our workforce in the not too distant future. Next slide, please. Okay, so here are some projections. A couple of things just I want to point out is that in 6 or 7 years, so this is for 2030, baby boomers will have gone from about 25% to about 9%. And Gen Z, that's at about 5% now, will be up to 22%. And I mean, none of this is surprising, but it's important to pay attention to. I also want to say this. There's some big differences, and I'll say it here just because it comes to mind, and I don't want to forget about it. But if you look at overall at our overall population, and you look at young married people sort of living independently, that number has decreased 50% since the 60s. The number of people actually living married independently. And I think that becomes really important when we start to talk about different generations and perceptions of different generations. So that'll come up in the next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's my disclaimer. I know that Dr. Gilkey gave an overall one at the beginning, but I'm going to focus on stereotypes here. And I'm probably going to overplay it a little. So if I say something that's offensive to you, I mean, it's going to say good, but not because I'm interested in offending you. I am not. But because my point is that perceptions and sort of general statements about generations can be really problematic. And if we start with the baby boomers, which is what we'll do, you are probably aware that of the meme, okay, boomer. So some of the sort of typical stereotypes about boomers are that they're out of touch, they don't know how to use technology, they've mortgaged the future for the millennials and the Gen Zs in particular, by hoarding all the wealth and all kinds of things. So, and for Gen X, you go to the, yes, thank you. The stereotypes for us are that we're disgruntled and cynical, that we're disaffected, that we lack loyalty. And this is a really interesting distinction, I think, between baby boomers and Gen X, and it shows up certainly with millennials and Gen Z, and in fact, even more so, which is, there was a time where many people, the job that they did and, whomever they worked for or whatever, that's what they did. And they did that for, most of their career. And then the Gen Xers, we came along and we said, you know what, we're not sure that works so much for us. So we're, we may be trying out several different careers and different employers and really looking for what is a good fit, which was perceived as a lack of loyalty, which I think is interesting. The Gen X has also garnered the term the Karen generation, and probably most of you have heard something about the Karen generation. Don't be a Karen, sort of middle-aged white woman who is always asking for the manager and wondering why kids are so concerned about their identities. that has certainly been very popular on social media. Interestingly, according to the Social Security Administration, the name Karen became very popular, started to really take off in the 60s. So, you know, it makes sense in the sense that there probably are a lot of Gen Xers named Karen, but in terms of a stereotype, it's pretty extreme. And then for the millennials, you know, some of the stereotypes about the millennials are that they, you know, everyone's looking for a participation trophy, that they're lazy, that they'd rather spend money on avocado toast than buy a house or a car or something, you know, presumably more useful, and that they'd rather complain than kind of buckle down. And I have heard these things. I don't know about you, and I will have time for questions later, and it'll be a little more interactive. But you know, I encourage you to think about, you know, what you've heard and who you've heard it from, and sort of, you know, I hear this stuff all the time in our you know, in our society. I think it's sort of a shorthand for a lot of things, but something to pay attention to. And then for Gen Z, you know, millennials on steroids, but really addicted to their phones, don't have any interpersonal skills. And I want to say this sort of side piece, which is prior to COVID, I was concerned my background is in behavioral health, and I've done a lot of work with adolescents in particular and young adults. And with the advent of technology, which I'm a strong proponent of, but I have been concerned at times. I mean, I've had sessions where, and this, you know, with teenagers who have said, we've been talking and they've said, you know, I'd rather text you this, and we're sitting in the same room, and I get it because it feels more comfortable, and that's sort of 1 degree of separation. So anyway, that's sort of an aside, but I was concerned about how technology was playing out with people before COVID. And then of course, we know how isolated we have been for a long time. And it'll be interesting to see what happens with that. I've seen people do very creative things around surrounding that and trying to create less isolating environments, which is great. But anyway, so back to the stereotypes. That Gen Z sort of don't respect their elders, and, you know, are in another world because of the internet. So these are some of the stereotypes, of course, that we hear and we know about. And the point here really is that, of course, if you dig deeper, and what I hope happened is that as I described the group that you identify with, in terms of the stereotypes, you thought, that's not like me at all. Or maybe that's a little bit like me, you know, in that one area, but like, you know, that's also like a lot of other people, which would also be true. And people who aren't necessarily my age, also true. So when we think about positive perspectives, and I really want to emphasize this, because I think what happens is that, I know what happens because, you know, I spent a lot of time in the behavioral health world. Once we believe a thing to be true, it becomes true. And in the absence of, it doesn't even matter what kind of information we're taking in, it just sort of morphs into fact. And so if my perspective is that there is a certain age group, a certain generation that's just impossible to work with, then that is in fact how it will be. You know, call it a self-fulfilling prophecy, or, you know, what have you, but there's no room then for anything other to exist. So one of the things I wanted to talk about was, you know, sort of reframing some of these things. And I will say this, just because it's top of mind for me. One of the things that I think is interesting, and we'll see how it plays out, is that because of, for financial and other reasons, it turns out that baby boomers are actually starting to come back to the workforce a little bit more than was anticipated. And so we'll see how that plays out. And the other thing is that there's some evidence that baby boomers are actually more technologically savvy than Gen X. Sorry, I had to think about how I said that. That's right. I meant to say it that way. And I'm wondering, I won't put it out there for you, but think about that. Why would that be? I was a little confused about that. And it turns out that part of the reason for that is that there are a lot of baby boomers who have grandchildren who don't live near them, and they want to be able to communicate with them. And so out of a sort of personal value necessity, a lot of baby boomers, there are other reasons too, but one of the reasons is that they really want to be able to stay in contact with their grandchildren, and that's one way to do it. So I think that's interesting. Whereas the Gen Xers are really raising Gen Z and some millennials, so they're with them all the time, not as concerned about the technology. So for baby boomers, if we think about them being workaholics, traditional rule followers, if we reframe that, that also can look like someone who's really reliable, consistent, and disciplined, and will, follow a structure and follow policies and procedures. For Gen X, as I mentioned, sort of the stereotype is cynical, disengaged, and lack loyalty, and the reframe on that can be that they're realistic, reserved, and impartial. Right. And a certain amount of impartiality can be really helpful in the workforce if we use it, if we leverage those strengths. For millennials, lazy, arrogant, needy, the reframe on that is a group who are laid back, who are confident, and who are self-aware. Now, this is a really important piece, and we'll probably touch on it in a couple slides, but I want to say it now. What I have seen happen is, and I'm thinking of, actually quite a while ago, I remember I was doing some work in an assisted living facility with the staff, and they had high school students who were coming in to help serve food. And I remember one of the supervisors saying to me, these kids, which I think probably every generation is, these kids today, but, these kids have no problem sharing very personal details about themselves. And I said, well, have you, you have some awareness of social media, that's not so uncommon, but it is different, right? And I've had managers say to me, gosh, this person seems to just want so much, want to talk about what's going on with them outside of work. And I'm not sure I'm so comfortable with that. But this self-awareness, I think, can actually be really helpful and cut through some of the stuff. Older generations may not feel so comfortable with that because it wasn't necessarily something that we were taught to do or even allowed to do, depending on our situations. So this sort of confidence. And then the other thing that I find interesting is, and this has been happening the last, I would say 5 to 10 years, where managers say, I hired this person and, they're here and a month in, they want to know how I'm going to develop them, as if that's a bad thing. Right? It is different. And I say, well, what are you going to do to develop them? Well, they have to learn their job. Okay, so how can you talk to them about developing in their job? It isn't necessarily that they're saying, although I know this comes up too, but, when are you going to promote me? But it's more like, how am I going to grow in this role? And growing in a role can be actually learning the role well, right? And becoming more competent in it. But it's interesting how off-putting some people can experience just the question. So I really try to sort of reframe that as, this is someone expressing a desire to put some roots down in this job, at least for some period of time, and to want to grow in it. So let's see how we can support that instead of saying, or indicating in some way, because of course, a lot of what we communicate is our body language and our paraverbals. And despite what we're actually saying or typing or texting, how can we communicate that we welcome, people wanting to know what the opportunities are for them? And part of that from a workforce perspective is that if we're not engaging in those conversations, then these people who are going to be the biggest part of our workforce are going to find somewhere else where they can get that, whatever that is. And then for Gen Z, addicted to their phones, obstinate, entitled, some of the stereotypes. They're also very efficient and can be strong-minded and self-assured. That's not necessarily a bad thing. That can be harnessed for good. Gone are the days, I think, where there was sort of this very strict hierarchy, and we'll look at work styles in a minute. And people kind of kept their mouths shut until, they were of a certain age or in a certain position in order to have earned the right to do that. And that is something that we can take advantage of in the workforce if we see it as a gift instead of a problem. So how do these different things show up in the workplace? Here's some examples. And I'll draw your attention to follower style, because I know that this comes up a lot in some of the sort of consulting work I've done with leaders when they're looking at a whole team and thinking about, I'm not sure that this person is really engaged or gonna, and by the way, here's another thing that comes up. Someone says, well, I don't know if I want to hire that person if I'm afraid they may be gone in a couple of years. And I say, that would be a win. Right. I mean, and that is the reality in which we have to be successful. So some people will stay much longer than that. I mean, when I look at the tenure of people at Northern Light Health, we have people who've been here for quite some time, and then others who come for a shorter period of time. They go off to do something else. Maybe they go off even within the organization, which is why we want to be having these conversations if we have opportunities for them. Right. Some go do something else and then they come back. And they come back because they've had a positive experience, and we weren't mad at them when they left. We just, we tried to help them and we supported them and understood that, for a period of time, this wasn't the right place for them. So in terms of follower style, baby boomers are known, and again, broad generalizations here, but for respecting authority, and there's a process and I'm going to follow it, and there's a hierarchy and I know who the authorities are. Gen X is known as being sort of cautious. You're going to have to prove that I should follow you. And I'm going to be a little skeptical about that unless or until I, learn differently. Millennials have a reputation for, and again, it's not true for all, as none of these things are, but wanting to know why. And when we look at change management best practices, when we look at a lot of we should be able to answer the why, right? And sometimes, and I know this because I've had this conversation with a lot of people, a lot of managers who say, it's not their, they're here to do the job, they shouldn't be asking why. I get that. Right. I do understand that, but also, can't we just answer it? Can't we just answer the why? And maybe that in that why is that there's a better process we could be following, right? Just because we've been doing something for a long time doesn't mean that it's the best possible way to do it. So there's some potential advantage in that for us if, as long as we don't immediately sort of discount it as a problem or someone being obstinate or resistant. And then Gen Z, and we'll see it more as they get further into the workforce and this starts to play out, but tend to be more independent and like to, collaborate with other people. So if you go down to the two other things I wanted to point out here, the communication style. Right. Some people really like in person, some people like the phone, some people, like video chat or email, others like text. There are some ways, sometimes there's one of these ways is not available, and that's okay if it's not available, but, sometimes in my experience, it's not that it isn't available. It's not the preference of, the leader or the coworker. And I think we have to, try to think outside the box on that. Just because it isn't my favorite mode of communication doesn't mean that I shouldn't be willing to do it if it's going to help with our work relationship. And then the messages that motivate. And I think this is really important because I think we all recognize that people want to feel valued. They want to feel respected for what's important to them. And so if you look at these different messages, which range from your experience is respected to, you're going to get to collaborate with other people and be part of something, right? That becomes a really important for some about being part. And I'm not saying it isn't important for other generations, but what do I get to be part of and who do I get to collaborate with becomes really important. But at the end of the day, what we find is that we all want the same things. right? You know, how we get there is a little bit different. So if you think about, which is true for just about anything, when you really start thinking about it, I mean, you know, people who, you know that they benefit from getting exercise or they enjoy it, they're going to choose a lot of different ways to do that, to accomplish that. Is there one way that's better than others? You know, it might depend on what they're trying to accomplish, but really, no. You know, is there people who have hobbies, or, you know, most of us, I hope, have some way to kind of replenish our resources and relax? Are we all doing it the same way? Of course not. You know, does that mean that the way I do it is wrong? Well, I mean, if it's hurting me, it might be wrong for me, but, you know, if it works and it's, you know, a positive thing, then great. So I think we're very, most of us are open-minded about a lot of things. And by the way, I'm not suggesting that the people on this call are not open-minded about this and interested. You're here. So I assume there's some interest there. But, you know, it sort of begs the question, like, how open-minded am I willing to be? Next slide. And a lot of it is about perception, right? And again, I'm going to go back to something I said before, because the power of the mind is so incredible. And once we've convinced ourselves of something, there's just, we can't, I won't say we can't, it is challenging to move out of that. And I'll give you a really quick personal example, which is absurd. So, but I'm going to share it. I have some very, I have younger neighbors, and this is just, I'm in it, so I'm sharing it. Okay. And I think it was like 1 or 2 summers ago, or maybe like a little bit into the fall, it was starting to be warmer, but I was running my air conditioner. I have units in the windows upstairs, and I came outside for something, and I ran into, or I sort of passed one of the neighbors, and he just, I think we said hi, or we waved or something, but I just got the sense that he was, I don't even know what I thought. And immediately I thought, well, he's mad at me for running the air conditioner, because that's not very, you know, environmentally friendly. And I kind of ran with that for like a week. And then I realized I didn't do anything with it, but in my head, it was all right, you know, he's upset with me because and then I realized you have no idea what's going on for him or for anyone else. But that's the kind of stuff that can happen. We have an experience, we make an assumption, and then that assumption and that perception, based on all kinds of things, morphs into fact, and we start operating as if that's truth, without ever checking it out, right? Without ever sort of, and I'm not saying every once in a while we might not be right, but, you know, in my experience with, you know, in organizational development, when I've gotten called into groups to help them figure out what, you know, what's going to help them function better together, I would say 9 times out of 10, there was something that someone said or did that someone else misperceived, didn't check out. And that became sort of the blossoming of this great, you know, conflict or upset, or, you know, lack of people, and people having to choose team, all kinds of, you know, what I think most of us would consider nonsense, but it felt real to the people in it, as it does for each of us. And so it's just something to really pay attention to. Next slide, please. And then one thing I'll just touch on briefly, because I've heard this a lot recently. I just had a conversation with a friend about this who runs a small business, and he said, I really need help. And I said, well, where are you looking? And he said, I'm not, because nobody wants to work anymore. And I said, well, you're definitely not finding someone if you're not looking. And so I just, for context, and this could go back all the way to probably before, but certainly to the early 1900s, periodically, you know, this issue comes up where, you know, the common sentiment is no one wants to work anymore. And all I will say about that is we don't want to get stuck there. Is it different? Sure. And could we spend a lot of time talking about who left the workforce and you know, started their own businesses, and who all the, yes, but there are still people. And I will tell you, from a Northern Light Health perspective, because I oversee talent acquisition here, we're seeing a lot more people coming out to hiring events, reaching out. Things are starting to shift. So next slide, please. what employees want by generation. This is, we've talked about work traits, but a couple things I wanted to focus on in terms of what people want from work. Millennials tend to like flexibility. A lot of us like flexibility, but millennials in particular may be looking for that. So when you're thinking about, what are you going to focus on when you are putting an opportunity out there, when you're talking with someone about an opportunity, as I said earlier, I think everyone wants some level of respect, but Gen Z is really interested in a culturally competent employer and in mentorship. The Gen Xers may be more interested in problem solving opportunities. I think at this point, the last I read, Gen X makes up about 55% of our leaders, give or take. And millennials are starting to come into that. And certainly there are a lot of baby boomers still involved, but Gen X is kind of in the middle of it right now. And millennials are really interested in getting training for new skills. Like I spoke about earlier, we need to be careful about deciding that, we're not going to talk to anyone about their development until they've been here a certain amount of time, and really think about, if I can have someone stay here and be a viable employee for, a year or two, am I willing to accept that that's okay, right? That, or that's the reality, whether I like it or not, that is the reality. Because if I keep rejecting people who I think won't stay longer than that, then I may end up without any options. Next slide, please. And then for advertising jobs and benefits, so this goes along with what we've been talking about. There are different things to focus on. Gen Z tends often, and again, broad strokes, is interested in sort of, the mission and the ethics of an organization. Is this a good organization? What type of work are you doing that resonates for Gen X? They like to be treated more as equals than in a big hierarchy. Again, that's not true for everyone. Definitely millennials and Gen Z like to have more remote work options. When that's an option, I realize with some work, it just isn't. Flexible PTO, flexible time off. Millennials like, social connection, exciting, internal culture. What are we doing? What are we doing as an organization to help our communities? That can be very compelling. And so on. So, you really want to think about not just what you're focusing on, but also where you're looking. Print ads, for example, don't tend to be looked at much, with the exception in Maine, I've found, of small communities where there's a kind of a weekly publication that most people tend to read. And we have at least a few, probably more, that I can think of, where that is the case. So we will place ads there, but most of the time we're placing them, on social media, on, certainly on our career site, but we pay very close attention to where we get traction. And one of the ways that you can really leverage, having a variety of people in your workforce is to, ask, if you were looking for a job, where would you look? Where might you find it? Because that's probably where I may want to, if someone is solid, that's probably where you want to at least take a stab at trying to find some folks. Next slide, please. And then, the benefits of having a multi-generational workforce, and there's lots of good evidence that supports this. Certainly multiple perspectives, lots of problem-solving abilities and creativity around that. Learning and mentoring opportunities, and the mentoring can work in a lot of different directions. Some people may have great institutional knowledge, while other people have, let's say, great technological knowledge, and there can be a lot of partnering in the mentoring front, on the mentoring front. Knowledge transfer and retention. It can really good multi-generational efforts can actually increase retention. There's a lot of value there, and people know it when they see it and when they experience it. And then a lot of unique relationships as well. Next slide, please. So we don't learn less from being curious, from actively listening, and from having conversation. And I think one of the best things that we can do, if there's nothing else that you take away from this discussion today, is to be curious about people and not assume that you know more than you don't. And that's true for all of us. I think about that a lot. We make assumptions very quickly. We just do. We're human. We try to make sense of the world, and our brains do that. But not to assume that what I think may be the case is true until I really know that it is. There's a lot we can learn from a, direct, open conversation. What's the best way to work with you? How do you like to be communicated with? That goes a long way in showing that you care, and also in getting that information. Next slide, please. And then I think this one, and there's a final slide. Best practices in terms of supporting a team, varied communication channels, which we talked about, reverse mentoring. We often think of mentoring as sort of the more senior, tenured older person mentoring the younger person. Lots of mentorship programs have turned that upside down, and there are really creative ways to think about that. Respect in general, avoiding assumptions, and mixing things up. I cannot tell you how valuable. I have a team with representatives from all 4 of those generations, the 4 that we've been talking about, and the really interesting, creative, very successful, so extraordinarily successful. Some of those ideas come from our newest team members who, are looking at something and say, "Hey, have we thought about doing this?" And, sometimes we try, sometimes we can't for some reasons, but it's been remarkable when there's a space for people to be able to speak up. And, doesn't mean you're going to do everything, but it's a game changer, I think. And final slide, please. So managing the 5 generations in the workplace, again, this goes back to, boomers may be more reserved in their communication style, whereas with millennials and Gen X, or Gen Z, sorry, you may hear a lot, have a lot of communication, often want quicker, more immediate feedback about things, looking for mentors and coaches, and again, aligning with company values can be really important. I'm going to stop there because I know we want to make sure there's some time for questions, but I appreciate your time.
Great. Well, thanks, Catherine. That's such a fascinating topic, like thinking about the generational differences in the workplace. So I'm going to give you a chance to take a deep breath and go through a couple of comments that came through our chat room here. First off, there's a couple questions along the way about having access to the slides, and they'll be available on our webpage starting probably late in the day tomorrow. A comment that one of the participants made: "My 22-year-old son told me recently I got the Karen haircut. Made me laugh. Being a Gen X, I am surprised of the lack of loyalty coming up in the stereotype for Gen X." So that was an interesting thing right there. Moving down. Many Gen Z started their careers during the pandemic. Think about that. This is like the start. So if you think about starting during like a lockdown, what becomes normal for these folks in terms of in-person work environment? You have comments about that, Catherine?
Well, I completely agree. And also, I'm so happy to see you, Martha. Well, I'm not seeing you, but I'm glad you're here. Martha and I know each other from a long time ago. It's true. What is normal for people who have come into the workforce in the last, since 2019? I will say, I think that the sort of, I don't know what to call it, silver lining is that some things have really gotten accelerated. Like, for example, our appetite for more flexibility in how people work, but out of necessity. It just had to happen, and so it did. So I would say we probably got a decade ahead of where we were unintentionally. It was just a unintentional consequence of a very difficult situation. But I think we're figuring out the new normal. So I agree with you. Without any previous experience, it's hard to know, but we'll forge this as we move forward, and hopefully we can be as flexible as possible as employers in thinking of creative ways to allow people to do good work.
Mm. Yeah, that's an interesting topic when you think that normal is working remotely and then there's something else. You know, so a comment from Aaron about your slide on people don't want to work any longer, and I think you started it what in 1991 or something, or 1981. He comments that he's seen stuff from Roman and Greek times along the same vein. So you may have to adjust your slide a little bit for the next presentation. So thanks for that, Aaron. This is a question from Carol. I have a work team of mostly Gen X and boomers. What I struggle with most is resistance to change. So if you think about, people saying, yeah, but it's how we always have done things. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. I think that's a question about resistance to change, and any comments along the generational lines about that. Catherine?
Sure. Yeah, is that so on the one hand, that is somewhat generationally consistent, except that, Gen X is sometimes known as sort of seeing change as a vehicle for, opportunity. But I think in general, resistance to change, and is basically people. I don't know your people, so I'm just going to say this. When people have been working for a while, they are either they're comfortable with what they're doing and they believe that they are experts in as much as they will be experts. And it is harder often, and I know I'm making a stereotype here, when people get older to consider having a new learning curve. It can be very provocative, understandably, right? Because we sort of think earlier in our careers will be our big learning curve, and then we sort of get to become the experts. So my experience with that is really going back to the beginning and talking about why this change now, and being able to answer that question. What's in it for the people that you want to, either it has to happen for some reason, so that's a why, or it's going to provide something. Something's going to come of it. So sometimes we have to kind of backtrack out of the actual change and really make that case, or sometimes we don't have the opportunity to, and then we just have to say, like, this is happening, and figure out how to get people to come along. But I certainly I hear the challenge.
Thanks. I'm going to switch gears over to you, Dr. Jarvis. You did a great job answering questions in real time, typing out the answers. So I'm not going to try to fit that into our last couple of minutes, but there was a series of questions about the bivalent vaccines, and I'll expand on that. So first off, we think we're just a few weeks away from the FDA saying, the bivalent can be used in a certain group of people in the coming weeks as we go into the summer time. And then we're anticipating something for the fall. Will it be a bivalent? Will it be the same bivalent? Will they be trying to chase after the variants like they do with flu? So a bunch of questions for you. You got 1 minute.
I got my little crystal ball again for you.
Yeah, I love your crystal ball.
So you're correct. The FDA is already discussing expanding out for a second bivalent booster for individuals. We expect that to probably be people over the age of 65. It may be for people over the age of 50, and then people with immunocompromising conditions. That's very similar to what's happening in some European countries right now. So we expect that. Remember, there's a process. Even if the FDA was to make that recommendation, it cannot be delivered until the CDC approves it. So we expect there'll be a little bit of process. So maybe mid-May, end of May, before we actually are able to start giving a second booster shot to individuals in that particular category. As far as for the spring goes, hard to say. Right now, if I was to guess right now, I would say it would probably be the exact same bivalent vaccine that we're using now. I do anticipate it will be a bivalent vaccine because those seem to be working very effectively, and we have not seen a major family shift, meaning going from one Greek letter to another. So we have seen Omicron family being the predominant strains for quite some time now, and we expect that to continue. So the bivalent vaccine would be good. One of the good things, though, messenger RNA technology is much, much quicker than the technology that we use for influenza. And so if we had to make a shift because we have a new family shift that has to be done, I think they could put that together in a couple of months rather than the 6 to 8 months it takes to do an influenza vaccine. So that's the positive thing about this great technology we have. and it's incredibly safe, very, very effective.
Excellent. Well, thanks, Dr. Jarvis. Well, Catherine, I have about another hour's worth of questions for you, and maybe we'll have to do part 2 at some point. Really terrific, but we're going to have to wrap up now. So we've reached the end of our scheduled time. We've included resources for you at the end of this presentation. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you to Dr. McLaren and Dr. Jarvis for the great information they shared with us today. I hope this hour helps you to successfully manage your business. Just a reminder, we will be emailing you a survey right after our conference. Please be sure to give us your feedback so we can continue to provide relevant information. Our next session will be on May 11th. Our topic will be social media, impacts on health, life, and business strategy. And this will be another not to be missed session. I hope you will join us. We will send you the link for this session. We encourage you to share this invitation with your friends and colleagues. By working together to promote good health, we will be promoting good business. Thank you and have a good afternoon.